March 23, 1944, 28,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany. Captain Walter Beckham of the 352nd Fighter Group has his P-51 Mustang's throttle pushed to the firewall, diving nearly vertical through a sky that's erupting in black blossoms of heavy flak. Each burst throws shrapnel fragments the size of a man's fist through the air at supersonic speeds. One piece through his engine, and he's done. One through his coolant system, and he has maybe 3 minutes before the Merlin seizes. One through the cockpit, and he won't feel anything at all. But Beckham isn't pulling out. He's pushing forward on the stick, steepening the dive, accelerating through 450 miles per hour, then 500, watching his altimeter unwind like a broken clock as the flak bursts multiply around him. Shrapnel pings off his wings. His aircraft shudders as a near miss throws it sideways. And below him, at 15,000 feet, flying in lazy defensive circles inside the protective umbrella of their own anti-aircraft guns, a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader. 3 flies in perfect safety, exactly where German doctrine said they should be, exactly where the Americans were never supposed to follow. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Oberleutnant Heinrich Ehrler and his staffel of veteran pilots didn't know was that the American diving toward them had made a calculation that would have seemed insane by any previous standard of fighter combat. Beckham had decided that diving through heavy flak to reach an enemy formation was an acceptable risk. Not because the flak wasn't dangerous, it was absolutely lethal, but because the tactical advantage of surprise against pilots who believed themselves safe was worth gambling his life. This wasn't the decision of one reckless pilot. This was the result of a systematic doctrinal revolution that had been developing since the summer of 1943, when American fighter groups began recognizing that their German opponents had one critical vulnerability. The Luftwaffe's most experienced aces, the men with hundreds of victories, the legends who'd been flying since Spain, had developed habits based on their own superiority, and habits could be exploited. The transformation began with a simple observation made by Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group in July 1943. He'd been studying German tactics through combat reports and interrogations of captured Luftwaffe pilots, and he noticed something peculiar. German fighters consistently broke off attacks when American fighters dove toward them through flak zones, not because they'd lost the tactical advantage, but because diving through heavy anti-aircraft fire violated every principle of self-preservation they'd been taught. German doctrine was precise and had been refined through 5 years of combat across every theatre. Fighter pilots were valuable assets, their training took years, and their experience was irreplaceable. Doctrine explicitly stated that pilots should avoid areas of intense flak, that they should never accept unnecessary risks, that survival of the aircraft and pilot took precedence over achieving a kill. This wasn't cowardice. It was rational resource management. Germany couldn't replace its trained pilots as quickly as they were being lost. But American doctrine was different from the beginning. The United States was training fighter pilots at a rate that exceeded losses by a factor of 3 to 1. New pilots arrived in England every week, already qualified in type, already trained in basic combat tactics. If a pilot was shot down and killed, it was tragic, but operationally, it was sustainable. This fundamental difference in pilot availability led to a fundamental difference in tactical philosophy. By September 1943, American fighter groups were being instructed to actively seek combat inside flak zones. Major General William Kepner, commanding 8 Fighter Command, issued a directive that was revolutionary in its simplicity. German fighters believe flak provides absolute protection. Prove them wrong. Destroy this belief, and you destroy their tactical flexibility. The aircraft made it possible. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was, by 1943 standards, a flying tank. Its radial engine could absorb multiple 20mm cannon hits and continue running. Its pilot sat behind armor plating and a massive engine block that could stop almost any projectile. Flak fragments that would destroy the liquid-cooled inline engines of German fighters would merely punch holes in the Thunderbolt's engine cowling and accomplish nothing. The North American P-51 Mustang, introduced to combat in December 1943, was more vulnerable to flak damage because of its liquid-cooled Merlin engine, but it compensated with speed. A Mustang diving from altitude could exceed 500 miles per hour, spending less than 15 seconds in the heavy flak zone, giving anti-aircraft gunners almost no time to track and adjust. But having the right aircraft wasn't enough. American pilots had to overcome the same survival instincts that protected German pilots. Flying into intense anti-aircraft fire violated every natural impulse. Flak was terrifying in a way that aerial combat wasn't. An enemy pilot you could see, maneuver against, potentially defeat. Flak was random, impersonal, unavoidable. You either flew through it and survived by pure chance, or you didn't. The training began at the replacement training units in England. New pilots arriving from the States underwent an additional phase of instruction before being assigned to operational squadrons. Part of that training, starting in October 1943, involved flying through designated flak practice zones where British anti-aircraft batteries fired timed bursts at specific altitudes. The shells weren't armed, but the psychological effect was identical. Pilots learned what flak looked like, how it formed patterns in the sky, how to judge altitude based on burst characteristics. More importantly, they learned that they could fly through it and survive. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, who would end the war with 27 victories, described his first flak training flight. They told us the shells weren't live, but my body didn't believe it. Every burst made me want to turn away. The instructor kept saying, "Maintain heading, maintain speed, don't give the gunners a predictable target." After the fifth pass, it stopped feeling like death was certain and started feeling like death was merely probable. That shift, from certain death to probable death, was everything. It created a psychological space where tactical decisions could be made. And once pilots believed they could survive flak, they could be trained to use it as a weapon. The first documented instance of an American fighter deliberately diving through heavy flak to engage German fighters occurred on October 9, 1943, during a mission to Anklam. Major Gerald Johnson was leading 16 P-47 seconds from the 56th Fighter Group as high cover for a bomber formation. At 26,000 feet, well above the effective range of light and medium flak, the formation was jumped by 12 Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 26. The German fighters executed a perfect attack, diving from 30,000 feet with the sun behind them, achieving complete surprise. They made one pass through the bomber formation, destroying 2 B-17 seconds, then dove away to 15,000 feet, where they reformed in a defensive circle, protected by a box barrage of 88mm flak that their own ground controllers had already positioned. Standard American doctrine would have been to reset, climb back to altitude, and wait for the Germans to climb back up for another attack. Instead, Johnson rolled his entire flight inverted and dove straight down through the flak zone. His wingman, Lieutenant Robert Landry, later wrote, "I thought the major had lost his mind. The flak was so thick you could see the shrapnel glinting in the sun, but he went straight in, and we followed because that's what you did." The Germans never saw them coming. The 109s were in their defensive circle, pilots focused on maintaining formation spacing, watching for American fighters at their altitude or above. No one was looking up at the sky they'd just left. The sky they knew was protected by their own flak. Johnson's flight came screaming down at over 500 miles per hour, far too fast for the anti-aircraft gunners to track effectively, and opened fire at 300 yards. 4 Bf-109s went down in the first 5 seconds. The remaining 8 scattered in complete disarray, abandoning their defensive formation, several flying directly into their own flak in their panic to escape. Johnson's flight pulled out at 8,000 feet, having spent less than 20 seconds in the flak zone. One P-47 had taken shrapnel damage to the tail, but all 16 American fighters returned to base. The mission report Johnson filed that evening was clinical in its assessment. German fighters believe flak provides sanctuary. This belief can be exploited. Within 2 weeks, every fighter group in 8th Air Force had received tactical guidance on engaging enemy fighters inside flak zones. The doctrine was specific: never loiter in the flak, never make multiple passes, dive through at maximum speed, make one attack, and exit. Use altitude to build speed that renders flak tracking ineffective. Accept that some aircraft will be hit. Trust that the tactical surprise will cause disproportionate enemy losses. The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate and profound. Major Gunther Rahl, who commanded the 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 11 and would end the war with 275 victories, wrote in his combat diary on November 2, 1943, "The Americans have begun attacking us inside our own flak protection. This should not be possible. Their losses should be unacceptable. But they continue doing it. They trade one of theirs for 3 or 4 of ours and consider this a victory. We cannot fight an enemy who considers such losses acceptable." What Rahl had identified was the core of American tactical philosophy. American commanders were willing to accept a loss ratio that would have been strategically disastrous for Germany. If diving through flak resulted in a 10% loss rate, but caused a 30% loss rate among German fighters, that was considered an overwhelming success. The mathematics were brutal but simple. America could sustain 10% losses indefinitely. Germany could not sustain 30% losses for more than a few months. The tactic evolved rapidly through the winter of 1943 to 44. Fighter groups began coordinating with bomber formations to identify known flak concentrations, then deliberately used those areas as kill zones. If German fighters dove away to seek protection inside flak, American fighters would follow immediately, using their diving speed advantage to close the distance before German pilots could reform their defensive circles. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who would achieve 21 air victories before being sent home in April 1944, explained the tactic in a letter to his family. "The Germans are very good pilots, but they've become predictable. When we bounce them, they dive to 10 or 12,000 feet where their flak is heaviest, and they think they're safe. So we follow them down. The flak is just as dangerous for us, as it is for them, maybe more so since our Mustangs have coolant systems that don't like shrapnel. But the Germans aren't expecting us. They're watching for flak, not for us. We get 3 or 4 seconds where they're not looking before they realize we're there. That's enough time to kill 3 or 4 of them." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang to combat operations in December 1943 magnified the effectiveness of this tactic. The Mustang could dive faster than any German fighter could follow without risking structural failure. It could accelerate more quickly out of the dive, meaning it spent less time in the flak zone. And, critically, it had the range to conduct these attacks deep inside Germany, where German fighters had previously operated with relative impunity. On March 6, 1944, during the first major American fighter sweep to Berlin, the tactic reached its ultimate expression. Over 600 American fighters, mostly P-51 seconds and P-47 seconds, penetrated to the German capital in waves. German fighter controllers scrambled every available aircraft, over 300 fighters from multiple Jagdgeschwader, and positioned them in defensive formations at medium altitude, 15 to 20,000 feet, protected by concentric rings of heavy flak around the city's vital industrial areas. The Americans didn't attempt to fight around the flak. They dove straight through it. Colonel Hub Zemke, leading the 56th Fighter Group, described the scene. Berlin's flak defences were the heaviest in Germany. The sky over the city looked like a solid wall of black smoke. Our intelligence people said no one could fly through it and survive. So naturally, that's exactly what we did. The Germans had positioned their fighters in what they thought was perfect defensive terrain. We proved theirs. No such thing as perfect defense if your opponent is crazy enough. German records from that day show the complete tactical collapse that resulted. Jagdgeschwader 3 lost 18 fighters without shooting down a single American. Jagdgeschwader 11 lost 22. The kills weren't distributed evenly. Most German aircraft were shot down in the first 30 seconds of combat before they could react to the Americans' presence. They were looking down, watching the bomber formations below them, when American fighters came screaming down from above through their own flak. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, who commanded Jagdgeschwader 77 and survived the war to become a general in the post-war Luftwaffe, later provided analysis that was remarkably candid. We had developed tactical doctrine that assumed our opponents would value their lives as much as we valued ours. The Americans didn't. They flew through flak concentrations that should have destroyed them, not because they had better aircraft or better training, but because they had accepted that some percentage of them would die, and they'd decided that percentage was acceptable if it meant killing more of us. The psychological burden on German pilots became crushing by spring 1944. They could no longer trust that flak provided protection. They could no longer dive away from combat with confidence. Every engagement became a potential trap, where breaking off might lead them directly into the guns of Americans who'd followed them down through what should have been impenetrable anti-aircraft fire. Major Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace of all time with 352 victories, almost all on the Eastern Front, flew several missions over Germany in March 1944 as part of a training rotation. He refused to fly any additional missions in the West, stating in his transfer request, "The Americans fight without respect for their own lives. This makes them impossible to predict. I prefer fighting the Soviets, who at least want to survive." The German attempt to counter this tactic failed because it required a fundamental change in pilot psychology that couldn't be trained in time. In April 1944, General Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, issued new tactical directives, instructing German pilots to maintain formations at high altitude rather than diving to medium altitude when attacked. The goal was to force Americans to climb back up for subsequent attacks, rather than allowing them the altitude advantage for their diving attacks. The directive was tactically sound, but it required German pilots to abandon their only reliable defense mechanism. Staying at high altitude meant staying in range of American fighters for longer periods. It meant accepting dogfights at altitudes where the Americans had performance advantages. German pilots, already exhausted and demoralized by 1944, couldn't make this transition. Within weeks, most units had reverted to their previous tactics, diving away to medium altitude when attacked, because at least that gave them the psychological comfort of flak protection, even if that protection was no longer real. The Americans refined the tactic further. By May 1944, fighter groups were conducting low-high-low sweeps. They'd enter German airspace at low altitude, beneath radar detection, then climb to strike altitude just before reaching the target area. This gave them maximum altitude advantage for their diving attacks, while minimizing the time German controllers had to position defending fighters. On May 8, 1944, the 357th Fighter Group executed this tactic to devastating effect over Berlin. They arrived at 32,000 feet, directly above a formation of 40 Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader, 3 that had positioned themselves at 20,000 feet inside the city's Flak defences. The P-51 seconds rolled into a near-vertical dive, accelerating past 520 miles per hour, and opened fire at 12,000 feet, 3 seconds before pulling out. 16 German fighters were destroyed. The surviving pilots, in their debriefings, reported that they'd believed themselves to be completely safe until American fighters materialized out of the flak above them. Several pilots stated they'd initially thought the aircraft diving toward them were German fighters that had lost control. The concept that enemy fighters would deliberately dive through heavy flak to reach them remained psychologically incomprehensible even after experiencing it. Lieutenant Walter Krupinski, an ace with nearly 200 victories who survived the war, was flying that day. His account, recorded in 1986, captures the psychological impact. We were in a perfect defensive position, heavy flak above and below us, fighters positioned to mutual support each other, everything by the doctrine. Then tracers are coming through the flak from above, and 109s are exploding before anyone can react. We scattered, complete chaos, not because we were outnumbered or outfought, but because something impossible had happened. They'd come through the flak. They'd come through our flak, which meant nowhere was safe. That realization, that nowhere was safe, broke something fundamental in German fighter tactics. Throughout May and June 1944, German fighters increasingly refused to engage American escorts. They'd position themselves to attack bombers, see American fighters diving toward them, and withdraw without firing a shot. Better to conserve aircraft and pilots than to accept combat on American terms. The statistics reflected this collapse. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe destroyed 118 American fighters in the West. By June 1944, that number had dropped to 41, despite the fact that American fighter operations had tripled in scope. German fighters weren't becoming less capable, they were becoming less willing to fight. The human cost on both sides was staggering, but asymmetric. The 8th Air Force lost 412 fighter pilots killed between March and June 1944. Of those, 39 were lost to flak while executing diving attacks through defended airspace. That 9% flak casualty rate was considered acceptable, even low, because those diving attacks contributed to the destruction of over 1,000 German fighters during the same period. For Germany, those losses were catastrophic. Each fighter pilot lost represented 9 months to 2 years of training that couldn't be replaced. By July 1944, the average Luftwaffe pilot in the West had fewer than 100 flying hours total and less than 10 hours in type. They were being sent into combat against American pilots with 300 to 500 training hours, plus combat experience, and they were being expected to fight using tactics that required split-second decisions under life-threatening stress. The tactical revolution reached its logical conclusion during the Normandy invasion. American fighters operated over the beachhead with near impunity, despite the presence of over 2,000 anti-aircraft guns. German fighters attempting to attack the invasion fleet would be bounced by American fighters, diving through the flak from above, often before they could even see the ships below them. General-Lieutenant Joseph Schmid, commanding Jagdkorps 1 responsible for the defence of France, wrote in his after-action report on June 7, 1944, "Our fighters are operationally combat ineffective, not because of equipment failures, but because of tactical paralysis. Pilots report that American fighters appear from unexpected directions at unexpected times, often from within our own flak zones. This has created a psychological condition where our pilots anticipate ambush from any direction at any time. Combat effectiveness has declined not because pilots lack skill, but because they have lost confidence in any tactical position being defensible." By August 1944, American fighter dominance over Western Europe was absolute. German fighters operated only in small groups, avoiding contact with American escorts, attempting hit-and-run attacks on bomber formations when fighters were absent or distracted. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to guerrilla warfare in their own skies. The tactic of diving through flak to engage enemy fighters was never officially codified in American doctrine because it violated too many safety principles to be written down as policy. No training manual instructed pilots to fly through heavy anti-aircraft fire. No tactical directive explicitly ordered such attacks. But every fighter pilot arriving in Europe after December 1943 was told informally, usually by their squadron commander during their first mission briefing, that if German fighters dove into flak protection, the Americans would follow. Captain John Meyer, who would end the war with 24 victories, explained it succinctly. It wasn't in the manual because it couldn't be. You can't write doctrine that says sacrifice some of your men to kill more of theirs. But everyone understood it. The Germans could have better pilots, better tactics, better aircraft. Didn't matter. We had more of everything, and we were willing to trade our planes and pilots at any ratio that hurt them worse than it hurt us. That's not noble or heroic. That's just math. War math. The German aces who survived the war and later wrote memoirs almost universally identified American tactical aggression, particularly the willingness to accept flak exposure as the decisive factor in the Luftwaffe's defeat in the West. They didn't lose because American pilots were better. Many German accounts acknowledged that. Individually, German aces remained superior in pure flying skill throughout the war. They lost because American pilots fought with institutional times, backing that accepted casualties as an operational cost rather than a strategic crisis. Major Heinz Baer, fourth highest scoring German ace with 220 victories, wrote in 1963, "The Americans did something we could never do. They treated their pilots like ammunition, not with disrespect, but with acceptance that some percentage would be expended in each operation. We couldn't think that way. Each pilot was irreplaceable to us, so we fought to preserve them. They fought to win, regardless of cost. You cannot defeat an opponent who's already accepted his casualties before the battle begins." The legacy of this tactical innovation extended far beyond World War II. During the Korean War, American fighter pilots used similar diving attacks through flak zones to engage MiG-15 seconds that would retreat to sanctuary above Chinese anti-aircraft concentrations along the Yalu River. The tactic remained effective because the North Koreans and Chinese, like the Germans before them, assumed that flak provided practical protection against rational opponents. In Vietnam, the limitations became apparent. Surface-to-air missiles replaced conventional flak, and diving through SAM coverage was genuinely suicidal rather than merely dangerous. American pilots had to relearn tactical patience, waiting for opponents to emerge from protected airspace rather than following them into it. But the underlying principle remained. Accepting exposure to area defenses to achieve surprise against point targets could be tactically decisive if the force ratio favored sustainable losses. Modern air combat doctrine incorporates this lesson through suppression of enemy air defenses operations. Before conducting strikes against protected targets, forces now systematically destroy or suppress anti-aircraft systems, removing the protective umbrella that might allow enemy fighters to operate with impunity. The concept of following an opponent into defended airspace remains, but the execution has shifted from individual pilot aggression to coordinated force application. Captain Walter Beckham, the pilot who opened this story diving through Brunswick's Flak on March 23, 1944, pulled out of his dive at 9,000 feet with his Mustang's airframe groaning under 7 G-forces. His gun sight was filled with the enlarged image of Heinrich Oehler's Messerschmitt, which had just begun a desperate brake turn after realizing too late that American fighters were among them. Beckham fired a 3-second burst from 200 yards. 50 caliber rounds walked up the 109's fuselage, through the cockpit, and into the engine. The German fighter rolled inverted and fell away, trailing black smoke. Beckham climbed back through the flak he'd just descended through, exiting at 18,000 feet. His Mustang had taken shrapnel hits in the left wing and tail section, 17 holes total, none critical. His flight of 4 had shot down 6 German fighters in 8 seconds of combat. One P-51 had been hit by flak and was streaming coolant, but made it back to England. The tactical exchange ratio was exactly what American doctrine anticipated, acceptable losses producing unacceptable enemy casualties. In his debriefing that evening, Beckham was asked if he'd been afraid diving through the flak. His response was recorded by the intelligence officer and preserved in mission archives. Fear wasn't relevant. The Germans were inside the flak because they thought it made them safe. Proving them wrong was worth the risk. Every time we follow them down and kill them anyway, the next German pilot we face will have that doubt. Eventually, that doubt becomes paralysis. That's when we've won. That psychological calculation, that each successful attack through flak created cumulative demoralization in the opponent, proved accurate. By late 1944, German fighter pilots were receiving explicit instructions from their commanders not to seek refuge in flak zones because American fighters would interpret it as an invitation rather than a barrier. The defensive tool that had protected German fighters since the beginning of the war had been transformed into a trap. The most profound analysis of why this tactic succeeded came not from American sources, but from a post-war interview with General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, conducted in 1956. Galland, who'd commanded all German fighter forces and was himself an ace with over 100 victories, provided an assessment that stripped away nationalism and pride to reveal a harder truth. The Americans understood something about modern warfare that we never fully grasped. They understood that industrial capacity translated directly into tactical freedom. They could afford to lose aircraft and pilots at rates we considered catastrophic because their production and training pipelines exceeded their losses by comfortable margins. This meant they could execute tactics that we knew were dangerous, because danger becomes acceptable when you can replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. We fought like we were preserving a finite resource because we were. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every aircraft destroyed took months to replace with our bombed factories. So our tactics emphasized preservation, survival. We would break off combat when conditions turned unfavorable. The Americans wouldn't. They'd follow us anywhere, accept any exchange ratio that favored them numerically, and force us into combat on their terms. They dove through Flak, not because they were braver than us, but because their system could absorb the cost of being brave. This structural advantage, invisible in individual dogfights but decisive across thousands of engagements, represented a fundamental revolution in how air warfare functioned. Prior to American involvement, air combat had been partially constrained by mutual recognition that pilots and aircraft were valuable. Both sides avoided fights where losses would be disproportionate to gains. The Americans removed that constraint by accepting that disproportionate losses were sustainable if they achieved strategic objectives. German pilot memoirs from the period after 1944 consistently mention a sense of inevitability, that no matter how skillfully they flew, how perfectly they executed tactics, the Americans would keep coming in numbers that eventually overwhelmed any defense. Major Gunther Rahl, in his autobiography published in 1982, wrote, "By mid-1944, we weren't fighting for victory. We were fighting to survive each mission." The Americans had removed hope from aerial combat. They'd industrialized it, made it a production process where they had infinite raw materials and we had none. The transformation of American fighter tactics from conservative escort duty in 1942 to aggressive offensive hunting by 1944 represents one of the fastest doctrinal evolutions in military history. It happened because American commanders recognized that their advantage wasn't technology or individual pilot skill. It was sustainability. They could fight battles that cost them dearly as long as those battles cost their opponents more. The tactic of diving through Flak crystallized this philosophy into a single, repeatable action. Every time an American fighter followed a German into flak protection and emerged victorious, it reinforced the message. Nowhere is safe, no defensive position is secure. Accept combat on our terms or die running. That message, delivered repeatedly over hundreds of missions, shattered German tactical cohesion more effectively than any technical advantage could have achieved. The young American pilots who executed these dives, many barely 20 years old, weren't motivated by hatred or ideology. Most interviewed after the war described their actions in purely tactical terms. They dove through Flak because their commanders told them to, because it worked, and because they trusted that the odds favored their survival more often than not. The aggregate effect of those individual decisions was the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. Captain Walter Beckham survived the war with 18 confirmed victories. In a 1991 interview conducted shortly before his death, he was asked if he'd ever regretted diving through Flak to engage German fighters. His response captured the essential nature of what American fighter pilots had done. Regret would imply I had a choice. I didn't. The Germans were there. They needed to be killed. The flak was just weather. You fly through weather to reach your target. That's what we did. Every time. Until there were no more Germans left to chase. The Americans didn't win air superiority over Europe because they were better pilots than the Germans. They won because they were willing to be more aggressive, accept higher costs, and pursue enemy fighters into areas where traditional doctrine said survival was impossible. They proved that in industrial warfare, sustainability matters more than skill, and that tactics which preserve individual lives can lose wars against opponents willing to spend lives to achieve strategic objectives. That remains perhaps the hardest lesson of aerial combat. Sometimes courage means accepting death as probable and fighting anyway. The Americans learned that lesson. The Germans never could. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.